Reports from not one but two newspapers in Great Britain, including the Times of London, which the big guy who owns this place owns. Officials are working on a possible exile deal for the man, Colonel Gaddafi. Could allow him to leave without the threat of prosecution for war crimes. But after a number of governments, including the United States, have claimed Gaddafi must be held accountable for killing his own people. With us now is John Bussey. He's the assistant managing editor of the Wall Street Journal, which is also owned by the parent company of this network. We don't like him. He's killed his people, but we've not sided with his people, and we're not warring. And now there's a consideration of letting him go escape somewhere where potentially he could launch terrorist attacks on us. And we revisit Pan Am Flight 103, but it wouldn't be Pan Am because they're gone. He would have to choose a new airline.
You know, the notion that he would get away is odious to a lot of people. If he pitches up someplace in a luxury resort and he's got his nation's wealth behind him and he lives a happy life forever, that does not seem to many nations, particularly those that are bombing him right now, to be a just result. However, what do you do? If you're pursuing this from a realpolitik standpoint, you want this to end. You want him out, his regime out, the fighting to stop, the devastation of some of these cities to stop, the killing of civilians to stop, the cost, to, quite frankly, to stop.
$550 million so far.
Just the U.S. The Europeans are also kicking in a lot of money on this. And the U.S. is saying $550 million so far, but that's ongoing, right? Even though we transfer power now for command to NATO, we're still very much involved. We're doing the refueling. We're doing a lot of things that are in support of this operation. All those things in consideration, if he were to leave and this were somehow to resolve itself much more peacefully, that might not be a bad calculation for the leaders who are meeting right now in Europe.
Wonder where you'd put him. I mean, they were talking about somewhere, some African nation or...
Yeah, and that becomes a political issue, not just for the nation that he goes to, but for the rest of the international community. If he ends up in some resort town, someplace on the coast in a comfortable life, that's just much more difficult for the world to deal with. On the other hand, looking back at history, there were many Nazis who were allowed to be let go after World War II, in part because the U.S. needed them to run the infrastructure of Germany and to keep the communists back. So there was a lot of tough, difficult, hard swallowing that had to happen on the Allies' part after World War II. You saw the same thing during reconciliation in Cambodia, the same thing in South Africa. A lot of people who have been guilty of very odious crimes going free because it was considered the better result for the nation as a whole.
So that I understand, this man who's been murdering his people for 40 years would then, in this new theory, be allowed to go off to some place because of the war that's not happening and the siding that we've not done. And then the people who are the relatives of the one he's been killing for decades will be just fine with that.
Yeah, not so.
Yeah. And then who will they love most?
We are in a war. We've taken a side,
and
that's pretty clear. And no, this would not be a good resolution for a lot of people if it were to happen. Mind you, this is speculation now, right? He's still resisting.
It's all speculation. We don't even know who we're fighting with, but not fighting with. We don't even know who they are. Yeah. There is a knowledge gap. We're getting to know them. I wanted to break out the song, "Getting to Know."
It's very difficult, right? And the U.S. has not yet officially recognized them for this reason, because we're not sure. Look, you know, what happens if we recognize a group that then, once they're in power, begin to purge Gaddafi supporters the way that Gaddafi purged the rebels? And we're in a position of having supported people who are just as murderous. So the U.S. has been holding back on that recognition.
Right. I remember when the rule used to be that you have to have an idea of what you want to do and who you want to go with and how you want it to end before you start the war.
Yeah.
Well, that was not a war. I know that.
But we watched together last night this speech by Obama in which he said, look, you know, there are certain principles of international existence that we have to observe, and that this would be, as he put it, a stain on the conscience of the international community if he had been allowed to go into Benghazi and just murder the city.
Yep, sure. Plan might have been good, though. John Bussey, thank you.
Pleasure.
WSJ.com. Great reporting from our buddies at the Wall Street Journal.